Over to you, Arezou. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk to the Historical Association. I'm so pleased you invited me and you've been so patient with me. And of course, COVID getting in the way, but we're here now. And I really look forward to introducing you to a topic that's very close to my heart and research, but also really look forward to meeting you, even if it's virtually, and hearing your questions and having a discussion going at the end. And I'll aim to not talk more than about 40 minutes or so, or maybe even less, so that we can have more of a discussion going. So let me share my screen first. And I do have a PowerPoint. Is that visible, Andrea? Is that all good? Yes.
Yes, that looks fine. Thank you.
Thank you. So, okay, so the title of my talk, The Barmakids, Islam, Multiculturalism and Power Seen through the Story of the Most Celebrated and Enigmatic of Families. The talk today will take you, basically, I'll take you on a tour around the world. We'll start in the Bodleian Library, which is just down the road from me here in Oxford. It's actually the largest university library system in the UK and recently celebrated its 700th anniversary. And a number of films were made to commemorate that fact. And I make a short appearance in one of them in which I introduce a manuscript that I'm going to be focusing on in my talk today, known as Akhbar Barmakian, or the accounts of the Barmakids. I'll tell you about the Barmakids obviously more shortly. By the way, a longer film, only two to 3 minutes, will be coming out later, I think next month. So watch the space. And if you are interested in following what I'll be talking about and things that my team, and I'll be introducing them to you in a minute, are doing, do follow us on Twitter or Instagram under the handle invisible_East. The next stop on our whistle stop tour as we travel back in time, let me just animate a little bit, so we're going from the Bodleian to India. That's our next stop, where the manuscript I'll be talking about was produced. And then we will be heading, there we go, slightly backtracking a little bit, going towards Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan and Balkh, where the Barmakids actually originate and where their story really begins in the 7th century. So I promised to introduce you to my team, and our work on this manuscript is being carried out as part of this team and this program, which we call Invisible East, at the Oriental Institute in Oxford. We've been building up our team in the middle of the pandemic and are very lucky to be so generously supported by the largest funding body in the humanities in Europe, the European Research Council in Brussels, but also the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK and the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And the impetus for this program really came to me while I was still a student of Islamic history, which isn't as long ago as it might seem, because I only took up this line of work and study as a second career after working at the United Nations for over a decade. And I was struck in the books that I was reading, I was struck by the silence on Persian and Eastern Iranian or Eastern Islamic contributions to early Islamic history. Early Islam was still very much treated as an Arab and Arabian product imposed upon non-Arabs. I know I'm exaggerating here, but that's more or less how it is. So this approach of dichotomies and presentist biases doesn't really work when you're studying the region that I'm studying, which was multilingual and multi-religious during the first 500 years of Islamic rule here, so from the 8th century to the 13th century. And in this world, people spoke lots of languages and often mastered more than one script. These languages certainly included Persian and Arabic, which are still spoken today, but also what are now dead languages, which I'll talk about in a minute. And our project tries to fill these gaps in our knowledge and give us more insight into this wonderfully diverse and complex picture of Islamic history. So our team here, so I am the principal investigator and work as a historian and a Persianist. And then I'll go to my right and go in clockwise direction. We have my two colleagues, Majid Muntazer Mahdi and Pejman Firuzbakhsh, who are Persianists, and Majid is also an expert in Islamic law. And then going round down the bottom, Zhanzhang, who is an expert in the dead languages I mentioned. That is Khotanese, in particular Middle Persian, Khotanese, Sogdian, and Bactrian. And then going further down, Tommy Benfi, who is a historian of late Sasanian Iran and early Islamic Iran, and an expert in Middle Persian and Arabic. Don't worry if you don't recognize these languages, I'll talk about them more in a bit. And last but not least, someone who might be familiar to some of you, Hugh Kennedy, who's published many, many books and is well known in this country as a historian of early Islam. And his focus has always been on the caliphal centers in Iraq, court cultures and administrative systems, and he provides hugely important intellectual input to our team. So I promised a word on languages. Let me just move down here, yeah. So Persian is the language in which our manuscript was written. And just to, for those who might not be so familiar with what kind of language it is, I think it is important to understand the linguistic context. Persian belongs to what's known as the Indo-Iranian language family, which flourished in Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, but also in parts of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and China. And it grew out of older languages, some of which are listed here, the dead languages I mentioned earlier. But crucially, after the Muslim conquests in Iran in the 7th century, it adopted the Arabic script. And here's a table from a recent study, sociolinguistic study of the development of languages, in which the author McWhorter uses Persian as a case study. And he lists 21 languages that are part of this Indo-Iranian language family. I've highlighted the ones that my team works on. Persian, or New Persian, as linguists refer to it, I just want to emphasize, is very different from Arabic. Arabic belongs to a totally different language family, that is the Semitic family. It has more in common with Hebrew, probably, than it does with Persian. Because the script is the same, Persian and Arabic, people who can't read the script might confuse them as one and the same. But just as English and French are not the same and simply share the same Latin-based script, Persian and Arabic are as much different languages. One interesting question is, why did people in these Eastern Islamic lands adopt Persian and not Arabic during Islamic caliphal rule? Other places like Egypt, which had other languages thriving, did eventually adopt Arabic and let go their old languages. But that's a whole other study and talk, and that'll have to wait for another time. For our purpose, what is relevant is that Persian was the language of the Eastern Islamic lands in the early days of the Caliphate, from Iran and then Central Asia to India in the 10th and 11th centuries, and became the official language of India at the time of the Mughal Empire, which was founded by Babur in the 16th century. Babur was fleeing rival forces in the Fergana Valley in today's Uzbekistan, southwards via Afghanistan, and eventually conquered India, setting the scene for what became a very powerful empire indeed. The later Mughals also became patrons of the arts, including manuscripts such as ours. So here's a map of the Islamic world, here bounded by this brown line in the medieval period. And here is the travel of Persian, if you want, from Central Asia down to India, and then being made the main state language, if you want, of the Mughal Empire from the 16th century onwards. So the manuscript. So here's an image of the manuscript, which is known as Akhbar Barmakian. It is one of the lesser known manuscripts, Persian manuscripts of the Bodleian Library, and I came across it during my research over for a good decade on the medieval historical texts on cities in today's Afghanistan, notably Balkh, which formed the subject of my doctorate at Oxford and my Oxford University Press monograph called Sacred Landscape in Medieval Afghanistan. Finally, I was able to take a break from my day job as a lecturer in Birmingham in history, medieval history, and could sit with this manuscript for many months, thanks to the Bodleian's Visiting Scholars program called the Bahari Fellowship. That was in 2019. I had proposed to work on this manuscript because no one had looked at it. And of course, I was very interested in the Barmakids. I had spent all this time learning about Balkh, and whoever studies Balkh will inevitably come across the Barmakids because that is where they were from. So the person responsible for getting the manuscript to the UK was probably William Ouseley. They were two brothers, William and Gore Ouseley, both eventually knighted, who had an interest in Persia and in things Persian and traveled in the area. This particular one might not have been purchased in Iran, where they spent most of their time, since it was made in India. But certainly William was a fine Persianist. The Bodleian was interested in Persian manuscripts, having acquired its first Persian manuscript just over 400 years ago. There are quite a few famous ones in the Bodleian, which I thought I might show you because that's quite fun, because actually mine doesn't have beautiful imagery. But here are some of the jewels, Persian jewels of the Bodleian, which incidentally are digitized, and anyone interested, I've given the link down here for you, can consult and look at some of these beautiful, often illuminated, wonderfully illuminated manuscripts. So here, for example, on the left, we have the Shahnameh, which is the famous Book of Kings, the great Persian epic, a copy here completed around 1435 in Shiraz in Iran for one of the grandsons of Tamerlane. And then in the middle, we have another document, another manuscript, sorry, which was John Greaves is another person who brought many manuscripts to the Bodleian, and he was a sort of enthusiast of all things astronomical, and this one, the great Timurid Sultan, who was also an astronomer, Ulugh Bek, produced these star charts, which John Greaves also used to publish his own observations. And then on the right, just to show you that some of these also have beautiful bindings. In this case, another manuscript that came into the Bodleian via Greaves is a copy of a famous poem known as Yusuf and Zuleika. So these sorts of masterpieces and showpieces of poetry and history with lots of eye-catching visual material abound in the Bodleian. But mine, if you want, is less known, and it's also not digitized. And I mentioned the Mughals. So let's let's show you how we know that this manuscript was owned by the Mughals. So manuscripts, I don't know how many of you have worked with them. I'm sure quite a few of you have, but those of us who work with them, what we love about the manuscripts is all the stuff that's around them. So this is just a flyleaf, an empty sheet that was eventually filled with seals of owners. Down here, we also have what looks like the price, 5 rupees. Were paid in the 18th century for it, which presumably was more than what 5 rupees would be today, quite a bit more. And you have the seals here of, and the names, we can read the names, sorry, Qirat Khan and another person, both are Mughal, well, one is actually a Mughal ruler, Ghirat Khan, who owned it in 1121. And that is obviously 1121 in the Islamic calendar. So the Islamic calendar starts in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad in 622 AD. And that converts, given that we have lunar months in the Islamic calendar, converts to about 1709, 1710. And then we have a later seal as well of a later owner who's also a Mughal official, also 18th century. So so this is obviously just an ownership, these are ownership seals. When was it actually written? So there we open the book, and then on the the manuscript, and then the very first page, which is beautifully illuminated in gold and blue, which indicates to us that it was made for a royal patron. Sorry. We have the statement in the very first two lines, and this is a translation. I'm currently working with my colleague Pejman Firuzbakhsh on translating this entire codex. So here we have the statement that I, Ziya Barani, have translated from Arabic into Persian this book of the accounts of the Barmakids, and then he says that it was decorated by his patron, and his patron is a certain Sultan Firuz Shah, or is decorated by his patron scribe, obviously, Sultan Firuz Shah. And we know that the Sultan ruled in the 14th century in northern India at a time of rule which is known as the Delhi Sultanate. So this is actually a 14th century manuscript that was copied 400 years later and then was owned by these Mughal rulers I showed you in the previous slide in the 18th century. So what does the text tell us about the Barmakids? And much of this we know also from other texts that were written previously in Arabic, but there's a big difference in this text that I'll tell you about in a minute. But basically, the story of the Barmakids is repeated many times in this way, namely that they are indeed one of the best documented cases of a leading family that came from the newly conquered lands, in this case, the remote and prosperous Eastern Iranian province of what's today Afghanistan, who converted to Islam, having served as keepers of the famous Buddhist temple and monastery of Balkh. And I've taken a picture of that site up in the top right, which I hope you can see. This dome here is believed to be still the ancient site of the Buddhist temple of Nobahar in today's Balkh, which is the capital of which nowadays is Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan. So the Barmak here was actually an official title of a person who looked after the Buddhist temple and monastery. And it was later in Arabic texts misunderstood as a personal name. So the texts tell us that this Barmak was the sort of eponymous founder of this family, and then they became known as the Barmakids, hence the name. And then in the text, then later, several generations later, a person by the name of Khalid appears as an active member in the coup that put the Abbasid family, so initially the caliphate was ruled by one family, the Umayyads, and then there was a coup, the so-called Abbasid revolution, in which another family took over the reins of the caliphate 130 years or so later, and 130 years or so after the time of the Prophet. And Khalid actually had a preeminent role in this coup, and which sort of foreshadows then the Barmakids' preeminence in this new Islamic government of the Abbasid Caliphate. Then his son, Yahya, becomes one of the most powerful and influential men of his time. This was due to his upbringing in the court, besides his father Khalid, and especially to his role as the foster father and tutor of Harun. That's his father, Harun al-Rashid, being the caliph, then later on becoming the caliph. Their wives nursed each other's sons, created a bond practically equivalent in Arab custom to kinship. And Yahya oversaw Harun's education and administered his princely affairs. Harun is shown depicted here, Harun al-Rashid, who some of you might have come across if any of you has ever read the Arabian Nights. He is the caliph in the Arabian Nights. And then Yahya has two sons, Al-Fazl and Jafar, who were both appointed to high offices almost simultaneously in the caliphate. And as sons of their father, were both generous and able administrators. Then, you know, this is the end, so to speak, of the great Barmakid era, because everything goes terribly wrong around the turn of the century in the early 800s, when the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, you know, who had such close ties previously to the Barmakids, has Jafar executed, his corpse divided and exposed in various parts of Baghdad for a year. So we'll talk about the fall of the Barmakids again in a little while, but what I want to go back to is the Indian manuscript. Why would the Indians be interested in this family that lived nearly, what was it, 1,000 years before their time? So if you look at Balkh, the link to India is not that far when seen from the vantage point of Balkh, which was known in the early Islamic period as the warehouse of India on account of it being on the main trade route. You will note that I avoid using the term Silk Roads, but it's what some people might call the Silk Roads. It didn't pass any of the Orientalists by either, like Alfred Fouché, who on his search for Alexander the Great's Bactrian capital in the early 40s, fancied himself as being on the ancienne route de l'Inde. So Balkh is the Arabicized name of Bactria, which was a pre-Islamic great empire, and Alexander the Great famously married one of the princesses whom he captured in Bactria and Balkh. And these French archaeologists in the 1920s and 30s were looking for that capital. As I mentioned, before the arrival of Islam, the Barmakids held the hereditary post of keeper of Balkh's Nobahar, which was the Buddhist monastery and temple, and which the name derives from the Sanskrit pramaka. Why this was such a hugely influential position might become clearer to you if we consider how Buddhist monasteries worked. And the Tibetan monasteries provide a good example. The Nobahar, the Buddhist temple and monastery of Balkh, was actually more than just a set of buildings in a confined space. The monastery, in fact, we learned from the texts, the Arabic texts, that it in fact controlled most of the Balkh oasis territory, which I've depicted for you here on the left. A vast expanse that stretched at least 70 kilometers from the foothills of the Hindu Kush, down in the bottom of this picture, to the south, on the south side, through to the old city of Balkh, up to the Oxus River, which is this water up here in the top of the picture. That forms the border between today's Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. A 9th century geographical account has survived in one important manuscript, and it gives the dimensions, but with the added information that many slaves tilled the land here. Now you might ask yourself, a Buddhist monastery managing massive estates nearly twice the size of Luxembourg, larger than the US state of Rhode Island, engaging slaves? That doesn't sound very Buddhist, perhaps. Well, actually, this was quite common Tibetan Buddhist practice right up to the 20th century. It was precisely what gave the Chinese communist leaders in the 1950s the ideological ammunition for annexing Tibet from the feudalistic and exploitative actions of its lamas. The Tibetan term jika refers to an estate or collection of villages that pays taxes to the government or the aristocracy or the monastery. This Buddhist temple was remarked upon by Xuanzang, a Chinese envoy on a mission sent by the Tang Emperor in China and visiting the most important Buddhist sites to the west. He qualified the Norbahar of Balkh as one of the richest and most bejeweled he had seen on his extensive journey, which had taken him from Chang'an in China through the Karakoram and Himalayan ranges to India, Afghanistan, and Central Asia in the year 633, about 70 years before the arrival of the Muslims. Even the Korean pilgrim Hyecho, who traveled 100 years after Xuanzang in the early 800s, this is around the time when the Barmakids have fallen, by which point the Muslims were already settled in Balkh, marveled at the Nobahar's richness and that of its host cities. So to run this massive estate and its temple and monastery gave the Barmakids huge levels of power and access to finances. What we also know about the Barmakids is that they had a large intellectual network that spanned from Balkh to India and to the Middle East, once they were ensconced in the caliphal capital of Baghdad. They had big ideas and ran multilingual projects, such as the translations into Arabic of Indian medical treatises, India's Panchatantra, which I'm showing to you here, animal fables translated, they had those translated into Arabic in the 8th century in what is known today as the Kalila wa Dimna, and which was converted into verse allegedly for Yahya the Barmakid. This is, by the way, also a Bodleian manuscript you can admire on the website. So I think it's clear to you now that the Barmakids were highly influential and why they might have reached such heights. What is perhaps even more remarkable about the Barmakids is not only their rise, despite not being of Arab stock, and their massive removal from power, but also the fact that their story has been told and retold so many times. And this is what fascinates me and which I'm going to talk about now. So how have they been remembered? The Barmakids are famous not only to Islamic historians, but are also pervasive in popular culture in the region, and even here in the West, unbeknownst to us. Primary school children in the Persian-speaking world learn about Barmakids in history class. I've shown a picture here I found online. In Balkh itself, which is the pictures on the right that I took during a visit, the capital, as I mentioned today, is Mazar-e-Sharif. So here is Mazar-e-Sharif and a plaque dedicated to Khalid, the son of Barmak, appears here in the so-called Wall of Saints in Mazar. But the Barmakids even pervade popular culture in the West, if little of their real history or even family name has been kept alive or is recognizable. So this is Jafar as he is imagined by the makers of Disney's Aladdin, which is of course a story from the Arabian Nights, in which the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and Yahya the Barmakid and his sons feature. For Disney, Jafar is the villain, the conniving advisor to the Caliph who tries to do away with the good Aladdin. But remembered he is. If we consider the more serious historiography, the earliest Barmakid narratives appear in the 9th and 10th centuries, historical texts which have been studied by scholars like the wonderful and erudite Edmund Bosworth, whose picture I have added here for you. The early Arabic accounts, I should say, are pretty dry and matter of fact. Stories start to develop later, and especially in the Persian Persian manuscripts. The overall narrative arch, if you will, is one of reckoning with the Barmakids' pre-Islamic past, which is usually referred to in the common term that appears in the Islamic sources in general to refer to the pre-Islamic time, which is the time of ignorance or jahiliyyah, and making amends for it. So our manuscript offers lots and lots of stories and lots of embellishments that you don't find in these drier Arabic accounts. Some of them are written to entertain, others to offer advice. Usually it's a bit of both. They read as tales on good governance, sound judgment, and generosity with which the Barmakids rose above all other people of influence and power. The book is therefore some kind of advice literature for rulers. It is about how to be the best executor of power and spender of money. It's a superhero story too. The Barmakids always come and always save the day of some impoverished has-been. The author then inserts himself at the end of every story with a concluding remark on the moral. These authorial interventions in the book of advice literature written for a sultan makes this text fall squarely within the genre of Mirror for Princes, or Fürstenspiegel, as it's known in German. So these were books written for aristocrats, royals, and other rulers to serve as manuals on good rulership. Only the Barmakids could get away with being neither royal nor of Arab stock and still enjoying such a privileged status within Perso-Islamic pre-modern writing as a way to serve as models for governance. So I am going to now give you a taster here on a well-known story of an illicit love affair between the caliph's sister, Abasa, and his advisor, Jafar, who we have spoken about a few times already, notably regarding the Disney film. He also appears there. So, and I'm going to end my talk with this story. So the backstory to this is that the caliph wants to enjoy the company of both of these people, his sister Abasa, who's not married, and Jafar, who is his advisor, but also companion, and he loves he's clever and he loves being around both of them. But Islamic law doesn't really allow them to sit together since they're both unmarried. And so he arranges with them that he will marry them to each other, but that this marriage will only be sort of exist in name, that it is not to be consummated. Unfortunately, the two do become drawn to one another, and Abasa, in this manuscript, it is Abasa who tricks her way into Jafar's bedroom. I should say in other versions, it's not quite her fault. Sometimes he has at least as much, if you want, takes as much initiative in this as she does, but in this manuscript, it is really her doing, and tricks her way into Jafar's bedroom, tries to seduce him. Jafar resists, of course, but the flesh is weak, and Abasa tries to provoke him and says, so here's first of all, here's Jafar, and he says, "O mistress, do not become my blood spiller, for which you will be held to account, for which you, and do not wish to dishonor upon my family. You and I have many enemies," etc. So he's trying to avoid this from happening. And then he says, the author says, begins to express niceties and behave coquettishly and asks, "Am I not your betrothed? There's no one in the world like me, and others would have sacrificed their lives to be with me. Why are you so scared?" And then she continues, "Are you not a man? Take heed and drop these unmanly excuses. In the end, the beloveds," and then the author explains, in the end, the narrator, the beloved's seductive talk worked on the lover's heart, and his eye of reason became blinded while lust took hold. The two desirous lovers' thirst was quenched, and they picked the fruit from each other's young trees. And then, of course, this is actually the story that sort of sets the scene to explain the eventual downfall of the Abbasids. So it's a love story that put the nail in the coffin for the Abbasids. But as I said, the Barmakid legacy remains. The Barmakids exhibit the truly rich cultural background to Islam and Islamic history, in which multiculturalism and multilingualism come to the fore. Perhaps their story helped the Mughals, going back to the Mughals, why were they so interested in this story? 1,000 years old, far away, but still with links to India. Perhaps their story helped the Mughals in managing the multicultural environment in which Islam and Indian religions came together. Perhaps we all can draw some inspiration from the Barmakid experience. That's the end of my talk. Thank you. And I'm at 40 minutes, so I think I did quite well keeping time. I'm going to stop sharing.
There we go. Thank you very much, Arezou. That was absolutely fascinating. Perhaps I could just get the questions off, just to start us off. Could I ask